Henry VIII and his unfortunate wives. Henry became the King of England in 1509 after the death of his brother Arthur in 1502. He was only 17 at the time. Henry then quickly married his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, just 6 weeks after becoming king. Queen Catherine of Aragon, born on the 16th of December 1485. Place of birth, Spain. Length of marriage, 24 years. Catherine was originally married to Henry's brother Arthur, but he died just 5 months after the wedding from the sweating sickness. 7 years after her first husband's death, she married Henry and became the Queen of England in 1509 at the age of 23. Catherine was a devout Catholic and a much-loved queen by the British people. She gave birth 6 agonising times throughout her 24-year marriage to Henry, but was not able to give him the son that he so desired. Their only surviving child was born in 1516, a girl named Mary Tudor, the future Queen Mary I, aka Bloody Mary. During their marriage, Henry took countless mistresses, whilst Catherine remained a loyal and devoted wife to him. He was particularly promiscuous with Queen Catherine's ladies-in-waiting. This must have been exceptionally difficult for the Queen, as it would have been with people close to her, right under her nose. Henry was thought to have had numerous illegitimate children, but there was only one whom he acknowledged, a son named Henry Fitzroy, born on the 15th of June, 1519. Although Henry now had the son that he wanted, Fitzroy was a bastard and could not be the legitimate male heir to the throne that Henry desired. In 1536, Henry Fitzroy died at age 17 of suspected tuberculosis. In around 1525, a young woman named Anne Boleyn came to court to serve Queen Catherine. It wasn't long before Henry began to take notice of her. Henry was 34 years old when he fell in love with Anne Boleyn. He still longed for a male heir and was struggling with his marriage to Catherine, who wasn't providing him with the things he wanted. This image depicts Henry bringing Anne Boleyn to court. You can see how taken he is with her. This would all happen practically in front of Queen Catherine's eyes. You can see her shown sitting behind Henry. It would have been quite clear what was going on. Anne Boleyn, born in around 1500, the exact date is not known, but she was said to have been 25 years old when she met Henry. Place of birth, Norfolk, England. Length of marriage, 3 years. It is said that Henry had fallen madly in love with Anne, despite originally taking Anne's older sister Mary as his mistress first. It was even rumoured that Henry had 2 illegitimate children with Mary Boleyn, a daughter called Katherine in 1524 and then a son named Henry in 1526. It is rumoured that Anne managed to keep the king's attention by initially rejecting his advances, claiming to have no desire in becoming the king's mistress and wishing to save herself for marriage. It's no surprise that Anne would want to protect her image. After all, her sister had become well known for her promiscuous behaviour. Francis I, King of France, even referred to Anne's sister Mary as a great and infamous whore and the English mare, possibly after taking her for a mistress during her time in France. Maybe it was a fear of gaining a reputation like this that made Anne abstain from intimacy with the king. Or maybe she was just well aware of how quickly Henry tired of his mistresses. Henry lusted after Anne. He admired her beauty and her intelligence. She was very well educated and excelled at many subjects, as well as being able to speak French fluently. The king also viewed her as pure and virginal, and he assumed that she would bear him sons. Henry was now hopelessly in love with Anne Boleyn. He wanted nothing more than to divorce Queen Catherine so he could marry Anne. He was determined to find a way to end his marriage, eventually finding a loophole in the Bible and demanding an annulment. Henry claimed that it was wrong for him to have ever married his brother's wife, interpreting a Bible verse as, "If a man marries his brother's wife, the couple will be childless." Queen Catherine pleaded with Henry to reconsider. She viewed herself as his true wife and the rightful Queen of England. Catherine proclaimed that her marriage to the king was valid and legitimate. She was adamant that her first marriage to Henry's brother had never been consummated and that she was a virgin when she married Henry. But Henry wasn't interested. He wanted rid of her and even tried to persuade Catherine to join a nunnery. On the 15th of November, 1532, Pope Clement VII denied King Henry his annulment, forbidding him from remarrying on threat of excommunication from the church. This made the king furious. He'd lost all patience with the matter. Henry and Anne had been waiting for 7 long years to finally be together. He wasn't going to take no for an answer. This was helped along by Anne Boleyn's reformer beliefs and some interesting literature she owned which helped support the king's desires. After Henry read a book called The Obedience of the Christian Man, he announced, "This is a book for me and for all kings to read." The book advocated that the king of the country should be the head of the church, not Rome. That was all the convincing Henry needed. He broke away from the rule of the Catholic Church and appointed himself as supreme head of the Church of England. Henry was 41 years old when he finally married Anne Boleyn on the 25th of January 1533. She was already in the early stage of pregnancy at the time. It took 5 months after Henry and Anne's wedding for Henry to finally get his annulment. He was still married to Catherine when he tied the knot with Anne. Catherine was then sent away from court. She was forced to accept Henry's new marriage, renounce her title of queen, and was stripped of most of her luxuries and royal lifestyle. But the cruelest thing that Henry ever did to Catherine was forbid her from having contact with their daughter Mary. This was out of fear that Catherine and Mary would conspire against him, so he kept them apart. Catherine only lived for a further 3 years, but she spent this time broken-hearted, lonely, and longing for her daughter. On the 7th of January, 1536, Catherine of Aragon died of what we believe was heart cancer. She was 51 years old. On the 7th of September, 1533, Anne Boleyn gave birth to a daughter named Elizabeth Tudor, the future Queen Elizabeth I, aka the Virgin Queen. This was not the long-awaited son the king had hoped for and was a huge disappointment. Henry had also been unfaithful to Anne, including with Anne's cousin, Madge Shelton, something which the new Queen Anne couldn't handle very well. Instead of dealing with the king's infidelities with grace and acceptance like her predecessor Catherine, Anne would lose her temper and become noticeably upset. This annoyed the king. Anne had her second pregnancy in 1534, but unfortunately she miscarried. Henry was starting to lose interest in Anne, and by 1535 he was already eyeing up his next love interest, Anne and previously Catherine's lady-in-waiting, Jane Seymour. Anne Boleyn knew she was on thin ice. To win back Henry's favour, she desperately needed to conceive a son. In 1536, Anne became pregnant for the 3rd and final time. Tragically, she suffered a stillbirth. It was reported that the stillborn child was a boy. Coincidentally, this miscarriage fell on the same day as Catherine of Aragon's burial. This was devastating. Henry proclaimed, "I see that God will not give me male children," and was cold with Anne, telling her, "When you are up, I will speak to you." Anne responded by attributing the miscarriage to stress caused by a jousting accident the king suffered just 5 days earlier. The king was knocked unconscious for 2 hours and seemed likely to die, causing Anne great distress and panic at the time. She also blamed her overwhelming sadness at discovering the king's affair with Jane Seymour as a contributing factor. Losing his boy was too much for the king to take, and he was done with Anne Boleyn. He began to suspect that Anne had tricked him into marriage by means of witchcraft. Anne was arrested for treason just a few months later, on the 2nd of May, 1536. Anne Boleyn was accused of witchcraft, plotting to kill the king, and adultery, including sleeping with her own brother. She was taken by boat to the Tower of London. Of course, these accusations were most likely entirely false, invented by Cromwell and Henry to remove the Queen now that she had failed to produce a male heir to the throne. Anne Boleyn was found guilty of high treason on the 15th of May 1536 and was sentenced to be executed on the 18th of May. However, this was delayed twice, and it wasn't until the 19th of May that Anne was beheaded. The extra weight would have added to her anxiousness and mental suffering, as Anne still had some hope that Henry would take pity on her and change his mind at the last minute. Anne was beheaded by a skilled French swordsman instead of a British executioner with an axe. This was a kindness granted by the king and would have been a more pleasant death. Anne's daughter Elizabeth was declared a bastard, and she was removed from the line of succession. Henry married Jane Seymour just 11 days after Anne's execution. Jane Seymour, born in 1508, place of birth thought to be Wiltshire or Somerset, England. Length of marriage, 18 months. Henry and Jane got married at the end of May 1536, just 11 days after Queen Anne Boleyn was beheaded. They are reported to have been courting for 3 months prior to Anne Boleyn's execution. This caused Anne a great deal of pain and upset. Despite this unfortunate beginning, Jane Seymour was said to be a gracious and gentle queen. She was thought highly of and was well liked at court. Jane was said to be Henry's favourite wife. She was obedient and content, peacekeeping and non-argumentative. Jane focused her time on more traditional pastimes like embroidery and sewing, compared to Henry's other wives who had all been highly educated and ambitious. Jane's passive and subservient nature had a calming effect on Henry. He was happy with Jane and all was going well. Although it was reported that Henry did briefly have regrets about the marriage, mentioning another potential woman he had an interest in, those thoughts were short-lived. Jane was a good influence on Henry. She encouraged him to reconcile with his daughters, Mary and Elizabeth. Henry did this and agreed to restore them to the line of succession after their own children. After 7 months of marriage, Jane fell pregnant. The king was overjoyed and he made sure that Jane's every want and need was attended to. Her pregnancy was described as unremarkable and she got through it without problems. Just a craving for quail's eggs, which Henry made sure was provided for her despite them being out of season. At 5 p.m. on the 10th of October 1537, Jane's water broke and she went into labour. Unfortunately, even with the high level of care Jane was receiving at the time, her labour suffered complications. It was an exhausting and prolonged labour. Jane struggled to give birth for 2 days and 3 nights. It was suspected that the Queen might not make it, and it was even rumoured that Henry was asked which should be saved, the wife or the baby. To which Henry replied, "Save the baby, as other wives can easily be found." On the 12th of October 1537, Jane gave birth to the future King of England, Edward VI. She had finally provided Henry with the son and heir that he'd always longed for. He was the happiest he had ever been. The kingdom rejoiced and celebrated, but the happiness wasn't to last. At first it seemed that Jane would recover. She attended her son's christening on the 15th of October, carried in on a couch to witness the event. But she soon fell ill with puerperal fever, postpartum infection, which was a common complication of childbirth at the time, likely due to the unsanitary conditions. On the 24th of October 1537, Jane died, just 12 days after Edward was born. Henry was devastated. He truly loved Jane and she was said to be his favourite wife. He was even buried next to her. After Jane's death, Henry mourned her for a long time. He wore black mourning dress for 3 months and he didn't look to remarry for a further 2 years. Henry was now 48 years old. He had remained single for 2 years since the death of his wife, Jane Seymour. He was being encouraged to remarry to help build British support in Europe, and the search began to find Henry a 4th wife. Negotiations were made and a marriage to Anne of Cleves was arranged. Anne of Cleves, born on the 22nd of September 1515, place of birth Düsseldorf, Germany. Length of marriage 6 months. She was 24 years old when she married Henry. Unfortunately, Anne is well known as the ugly wife of Henry VIII. Anne tried hard to please the king, even learning how to play cards and doing all she could to acquaint herself with British customs and culture. But when Anne arrived in England, it became immediately clear that she was not quite as beautiful as had been reported. After their first meeting, the king reportedly wanted out of the wedding. He stated, "I like her not." Despite this, Henry and Anne got married on the 6th of January 1540. On the day of the wedding, it was reported the king confided in Cromwell, saying, "If it were not to satisfy the world and my realm, I would not do that I must do this day for none earthly thing." After the wedding, Henry attempted to consummate the marriage, but could not. He repeatedly tried for 4 nights in a row before giving up. Henry blamed Anne for his lack of sexual appetite. He made cruel remarks about her body, saying, "She is nothing fair and have very evil smells about her." He also doubted her virginity. After inspecting her body, he cruelly said that he plainly mistrusted her to be no maid by reason of the looseness of her belly and breasts and other tokens, proclaiming, "I have left her as good a maid as I found her." A little harsh considering Anne was actually deemed prettier than Henry's 5th wife, Catherine Parr. It's altogether more likely that Henry's own health problems, obesity, impotence, and a pus-oozing wound on his leg which wouldn't heal, could be the cause of his failure to consummate the marriage. Also, his attention had already been captured by the young Catherine Howard. It could be argued that Henry never intended to consummate the marriage, knowing that he already wanted to end it. The marriage was annulled on the 12th of July, 1540. Anne agreed to the annulment and was fondly known from then on as the king's beloved sister. She was granted properties and income and was well taken care of for the rest of her days. Catherine Howard. Born somewhere between 1518 and 1525, it is not exactly known. Place of birth, Lambeth, London. Length of marriage, 18 months. Catherine Howard was just a teenager when her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, brought her to court to serve as a lady-in-waiting to the soon-to-be Queen Anne of Cleves. It is reported that Catherine may have been as young as 15, but it's more likely that she was around the age of 18. Henry and Catherine got married on the 28th of July, 1540, just 2 weeks after his annulment to Anne of Cleves. It is believed that Catherine Howard was just 19 years old when they married, while Henry was 49. She was also first cousin to Queen Anne Boleyn. Despite being from an aristocratic family, she grew up poor and was sent to live on the ward of the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, along with other young girls of noble households. She received little education or care there. The girls were often left to their own devices and would get up to mischief and drink alcohol. It's reported that men would often sneak into the girls' bedchambers, taking advantage of their vulnerability and misfortune. Catherine herself was subject to the advances of her music teacher, Henry Mannix, when she was just 12. Apparently they were caught by the Dowager Duchess before having full sexual intercourse, but they were witnessed embracing. Just a couple of years later, at age 14, she became romantically involved with a man named Francis Dereham, the Duchess's secretary. The pair embarked on a passionate love affair, even playfully referring to each other as husband and wife. Of course, King Henry knew nothing of Catherine's past liaisons and assumed her to be a virgin when they met. Henry was besotted with the young Catherine and showered her with extravagant gifts and luxuries throughout their courtship and marriage. She was described as giddy, giggly and brisk, and was said to enjoy music and dancing. It was reported that in her apartments she would do nothing but dance and rejoice. No doubt she would have been having the time of her life at court, being spoilt with countless gifts and indulging in extravagant Tudor banquets and parties. At this point, the king was not a well man. He was in tremendous pain and was morbidly obese. The ulcers on his leg would often leave him bedridden for long periods of time. It is not clear if Henry even managed to consummate his marriage to Catherine Howard, or if he was too unwell to indulge in sex at all. Catherine never fell pregnant or produced any children with the king. The fun-loving queen would have been quite lonely, especially in comparison to her old life where she received endless male attention. Much to Catherine's horror, her past quickly came back to haunt her. Just a few months after becoming queen, her ex-lover Francis Dereham made the risky move of reappearing in Catherine's life. He badgered the queen for work, and she would have most likely felt the need to oblige, knowing that this man could ruin her. She appointed him as her secretary, a move she would one day regret. He behaved irresponsibly and boasted about how much the Queen liked him. This must have been stressful for Catherine to deal with. On the 28th of June, 1541, just 6 months into her marriage with Henry, Catherine began a love affair with a man named Thomas Culpeper. Culpeper was a young, good-looking man and a member of the King's Privy Chamber. He was well liked by the King and was confident and charming. The Queen fell deeply in love with him, taking him as her lover and meeting him in secret to carry out their dangerous affair. But it wasn't long before the King got news of rumours about the Queen's scandalous past. On the 15th of November, 1541, Henry opened a letter that had been left for him. It detailed the Queen's promiscuous behaviour at her former residence and disclosed her relationship with Francis Dereham, detailing their past sexual history and, even worse, acknowledging that they had a pre-contract of marriage. If this was true, then the King's marriage would have been unlawful. An investigation was launched and Dereham was arrested. He was taken to the Tower and tortured. Dereham confessed to having a pre-contract of marriage with Catherine, but he denied having carnal knowledge of the Queen. For if they had have had sexual intercourse, this would have made their pre-contract as legal as an actual marriage. Catherine's ladies were also interrogated. One who used to reside with her at the time confessed to witnessing her and Dereham, saying, "There was much panting and puffing in the communal bedchamber, and they were forever hanging together by the belly like sparrows." Queen Catherine herself even confessed to her and Dereham once having a sexual relationship, although she describes herself as being manipulated by him, stating in her letter to the King, "Francis Dereham, by many persuasions, procured me to his vicious purpose, and obtained first to lie upon my bed with his doublet and hose, and after within the bed, and finally he lay with me naked, and used me in such sort as a man does his wife, many and sundry times." Catherine knows she has done wrong by not disclosing her history before their marriage and begs Henry, "Now the whole truth being declared unto your majesty, I most humbly beseech you to consider the subtle persuasions of young men and the ignorance and frownness of young women." It seemed Henry was actually going to take pity on Catherine. The pre-contract would simply make their marriage invalid, meaning Catherine would fall from grace and lose her title and privileges, but she would keep her head. That is, until under torture, Francis Dereham, whilst denying his own sexual relations with the Queen, disclosed her affair with Thomas Culpeper. He stated that Culpeper had succeeded him in the Queen's affections. Thomas Culpeper was arrested in December 1541. He was tortured and his possessions were searched. Amongst them, they found a love letter sent from Queen Catherine. The letter was damning evidence of their affair. Within it, the Queen writes, "It makes my heart die to think what fortune I have that I cannot always be in your company." Signing off with, "Yours as long as life endures." Their crimes were now undeniable, although that didn't stop them from blaming each other. Culpeper claimed that the Queen loved him and would not let him end it, whilst Catherine claimed that Culpeper ceaselessly begged her for meetings. Either way, the outcome was the same. Henry had been cuckolded and publicly humiliated again. He was devastated and fell into a deep depression. Catherine was arrested, and it was said that she briefly broke free from her guards and ran through Hampton Court, hysterically screaming for Henry's mercy. On the 10th of December 1541, Francis Dereham and Thomas Culpeper were executed for treason. Dereham was hung, drawn and quartered, whilst Culpeper was shown some mercy and was just beheaded. Both of their heads were then impaled on spikes and displayed on Tower Bridge, where they remained for 5 years until 1546. Katherine would have witnessed the harrowing sight of her former lovers' heads as she was brought into the tower by barge. 2 months later, on the 15th of February 1542, Katherine was executed. She was beheaded by axe. She was said to be so terrified that she needed help to climb the scaffold. During her final words, she acknowledged that she had done wrong and that she deserved 1,000 deaths for betraying the king who had always treated her so gracefully. But legend has a different version of her final words. It is written that before her death she proclaimed, "I die a queen, but I would rather have died the wife of Culpeper." Catherine Parr, born in 1512, place of birth Blackfriars, London, length of marriage 5 years. Henry married Catherine Parr on the 12th of July 1543, 18 months after Catherine Howard's execution. Henry was 52 years old when they married and Catherine was 30. Out of all the queens of England, Catherine Parr has been married the most times. Having 2 husbands before Henry, she was a widow when they met. Although she did already have her heart set on marrying Thomas Seymour at the time, she put her feelings aside to marry the king. She began her life at court as a member of Princess Mary's household. She was described as attractive and was very intelligent. Catherine was a religious reformer and was the first queen to have books published. She wrote 3 of them: Prayers or Meditation, The Lamentation of a Sinner, and Psalms or Prayers. Her religious beliefs soon drew attention and she made enemies at court. Luckily, she was warned and made the smart decision to go straight to Henry and plead for forgiveness. Henry forgave her, and even though an arrest warrant was drawn up for Catherine, thankfully it was never used. Henry and Catherine didn't have any children. It was likely that Henry was too unwell by now to consummate their marriage or to try to conceive. But Catherine loved Henry's children, forming close bonds with all of them. She even had an active role in Elizabeth and Edward's education. It wasn't until after Henry's death that Catherine would go on to have her own child. On the 28th of January 1547, King Henry VIII died. Catherine Parr was now free to marry the man she always wanted, Thomas Seymour. Catherine and Thomas got married just a few months later, but unfortunately she only managed to outlive Henry by 1 year and 8 months. In 1548, Catherine gave birth to a beloved daughter that she named Mary. Tragically, she died just 3 days later from puerperal fever.